Introduction to UK Defence Spending. Alright, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening in the UK economy, and Starmer's final days as Prime Minister, where it appears that he is trying to get as much money to the military as possible. And I was listening to a speech from Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, and she was complaining that Starmer is not giving enough to the military. They're playing this game. I mean, it's obvious that they're both on the same page, and it's this good cop, bad cop. You know, Starmer says, I'll give 10 billion or 11 billion, and then Kemi comes along and says, that's not enough. So you have this little game that they're playing, but they're all working for the same team. Anyway, Starmer's trying to get more money to the military, and this is a pattern that we're seeing throughout Europe. What are your thoughts? Well, this is exactly right. I mean, we got another commitment to spend £15 billion more on defense over 4 years, and we've discussed this in many programs now, Britain is very heavily taxed. Some would say, I would say, overtaxed. It is in very acute debt. Debt to GDP ratio is about 100%. There really isn't very much room to increase defense spending in the way that people continuously and persistently demand. The only way to increase defense spending is either to borrow even more, which is of course what is happening in Germany. But then the Germans are not yet at a 100% debt to GDP ratio as Britain is, so they have a little bit more space to borrow. The British don't. So how are you going to fund increases in defense spending? Well, Starmer obviously has decided to increase defense spending. That was inevitable. The way he's done it is by cutting the infrastructure budget. Britain's heavy debt limits new spending. So there'll be less spending on roads and on the energy system, which has upset many people. Who needs that stuff? Who needs that stuff? So that is his proposal. Then, of course, what happens is you get all the military people demanding more and more money to be spent because, as far as they're concerned, more is never enough. We have the entire political class, from one end of it to the other, demanding that even more money should be spent. Nobody explains how this money is going to be funded, what exactly is going to be cut in order to fund defense spending. You sometimes get the impression that some people think that the benefit budget can be cut. Well, probably it can, but then of course if you start cutting benefits for people, Social Security, that tends to be very unpopular. And which group within society whose Social Security are you going to take away to fund defense spending? Badenoch and people like that never ask that question. And then, of course, the other thing that you quickly discover is that when you drill into Starmer's figures, cutting infrastructure to fund the military, increasing the total amount that he is spending on defense, but the greater part of it is actually going to go on beefing up Britain's nuclear forces. Which means that the conventional forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, are actually going to get less. The point is that spending money on the nuclear forces is very, very good for the big defense contractors because that's where the big contracts are and where the big amount of money is. But spending money on making drones and building tanks, shells, artillery guns, and all of that kind of thing, nobody really wants to do that because there aren't big profits to be made in it. So what ultimately is going to happen is we're going to spend more on defense. We're going to see our infrastructure in Britain deteriorate, our roads and our energy system deteriorate. And we're going to get more in terms of our nuclear weapons capability in about 20 years, when all of these investments eventually deliver something. And in the meantime, our Army, our Navy, our Air Force will continue to decline. So we spend more and we get less. Yeah. Sounds like a good scam that he has going on. It is. Nuclear forces get the biggest funding boost. The secret isn't drones. Drones were the wonder weapon that's going to defeat Russia. Well, a lot of people are talking about drones. Big margins? Not big margins. Nowhere near big margins. What is already happening is contractors who are being asked to build drones are coming forward and saying, you know, we can make these drones better. Let's add a jet engine here. Let's add a radar there. Let's make them more and more sophisticated. Of course that increases the profit margins and makes it worthwhile to build these things. So the result is that we are going to get more drones, but they're going to be very expensive and very complicated. Going to be drones of the kind that many people are thinking about, the simple, cheap drones that we've seen being used in the war in Ukraine. And by the way, I predict we're going to see the same pattern right across Western industry, in the United States and Europe too. Because ultimately it just isn't profitable for companies to make cheap drones. The problem with expensive complicated drones. Except, of course, that you will get scammers. And I want to say this because already there's some evidence that some contracts in Britain are being picked up by people who you might describe as scammers. People who have no experience of weapons production, no experience indeed of any kind of production, but who are well connected. Probably they will make quite a lot of money out of this. But what they will actually deliver, nobody can ever be quite sure. I have to be extremely careful what I say here because obviously there are legal issues. But already this is being. I know it's being talked about privately, and we're going to see an awful lot of this happen. By the way, that is also going to happen across European industry too. Scammers cashing in on defense contracts. Yeah. You said Germany has more space. Germany has more space, and it has a bigger industrial base. They can borrow. But even Germany is now running into problems. So we had a major crisis about a week ago when the German railways, which used to be one of the most efficient railway systems in Europe, came to a complete grinding stop. Problems with signals meant the entire railway system had to be shut down for 2 hours. It took many days for things to be sorted out. Anybody who uses German railways today, as I have had to do several times, will know that it is becoming practically a nightmare. Infrastructure in Germany is also in decline. Friedrich Merz, of course, when he became chancellor, announced that there would be a relaxation of the debt brake in order to sort out these infrastructure problems. But what is really happening is that the big profits, of course, are being made in defense, which is where Merz is really interested. So the funding on infrastructure isn't happening to anything like the scale that many people expected. Germany continues to run up debts, and it continues to find problems in increasing defense spending because even though it has a bigger industrial base, again it's not geared and it's not structured for high-volume production of weapons. No Western country today is geared for high production volumes of weapons. Germany's railway crisis and debt struggles. And we're starting to get problems. So there was this big plan put together by Rheinmetall to build very big warships, bigger than the Arleigh Burke destroyers of the US Navy. Proved beyond Rheinmetall's ability to manage. That's my own view. The shipyards, which were mostly in the Netherlands, really couldn't cope with this program very well. It's had to be cancelled even though huge amounts of money have already been spent on it. They're now thinking of another new program to build smaller frigates to replace these big destroyers. I don't think we're going to see these frigates either. We saw the same thing happen in the United States. The United States was going to produce all kinds of very advanced frigates. Then they were going to produce cheaper frigates. Then the frigates they got were more expensive. This is going to reproduce itself right across the industrialized West. We really would require a major reorganization in our industrial system to be able to produce weapons in a cheap way. The Germans, the Americans might be able to do it. The Germans, in my opinion, cannot do it. The British are not even trying.